Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Booth, and I'm the director of the Jean Mayer USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts University. I am really excited to introduce our seminar today. The prominence of the speakers is outstanding. The importance of the topic, one we don't discuss very often. And also, we're going to have a very interactive nature of this seminar, which I think will generate a lot of discussion and future collaborations and ideas. So, in terms of our speakers, our first speaker is going to be Nicolai Wohns, who is a board certified internist and bioethicist whose work sits at the intersection of medical ethics, geroscience, and the philosophy of aging. He received his medical degree from Penn State, and he is currently a doctoral candidate in philosophy at the University of Washington, where his research focuses on the normative significance of aging, examining the relationship between biological aging and moral growth. During his doctorate, he founded the University of Washington's graduate aging group, and he also served as an editorial fellow with the Journal of Ethics, where he oversaw a special issue of Anti-Aging as an Enterprise of Medicine, which convened leading thinkers to address urgent questions at the intersection of geroscience, clinical medicine, and bioethics. Our second speaker is Dr. Daniel Promislow, who received his doctorate at Oxford University, during which time he developed an interest in the evolution of aging with a focus on differences in lifespan across the species. He has worked in the Department of Genetics at University of Georgia. He then was at the University of Washington, and we were very grateful when 2 years ago, Daniel relocated to the USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging. Dr. Promislow studies aging in genetic. Oh, we've got a little bit of static there. Sorry about that. And he has been recognized with numerous awards for his work, including the Glenn Research Award from the Glenn Foundation for Medical Research. He is the co-founder and co-director of the Dog Aging Project, a longitudinal study of tens of thousands of pet dogs throughout the United States. I could go on and on about our two speakers, but instead I'm going to turn it over to them. But before you start, I just want to remind everyone we have a Q&A option we have a chat option at the bottom where you can put in your questions, and we will hope to have about 15 minutes at the end for you to ask questions. Yeah, there's a Q&A one at the bottom of the screen. So with that, Daniel, Nicolai, we're looking forward to your seminar. Take it away.
Thank you. And especially thank you for inviting us to give this presentation, which for us, and I'm sure for most of you, will be an unusual format. It really is mostly going to be a conversation between Dr. Wohns and myself that reflects our own history of conversations when I was at the University of Washington that led to a paper in the American Medical Association Journal of Ethics that we co-authored. And I'm going to start by just briefly showing you some slides to lay the foundation that really is the foundation of knowledge that Dr. Wohns and I discussed and realized that there was something worth writing about here from our mutual perspectives. So to start with is a few observations. First, lifespan in human history, for most of human history, was pretty flat. We have data now going back thousands of years, and life expectancy at birth was somewhere around 30 to 40 years, and then something really unusual happened starting around 1850. And you can see that here, for each line represents a different country, and you can see whether for countries that have a relatively low lifespan or high lifespan, around 1850, lifespan started going up quite dramatically. And why that happened is illustrated partly here. If we separate, these are data for the US, and if we separate infectious diseases, mortality due to infectious diseases and mortality due to non-infectious causes, you can see that mortality due to non-infectious causes has actually been relatively flat, at least in the 20th century, whereas the real progress has been in the decrease in infectious diseases, and especially in children. And why is that? Well, it's interesting. If we look at what the major factors are that have had the biggest bang for their buck, in fact, right at the top, you might be surprised to see our toilets, invented about 150 years ago and estimated to have saved 1 billion lives because of improvement in sanitation. And then these others all, I'm sure, will make sense to you and have saved really billions of lives. And what stands out, and this was really a focus of our paper, was despite, I would say, about 30 or 40 years of really hard work on the part of geroscientists to try and figure out how to increase healthy lifespan, the big progress that we saw over the last 150 years was primarily not due to the kinds of things we discover in the lab that help individuals, but really public health initiatives. So what can we do as individuals to maximize our own healthy lifespan? We actually have a pretty good idea of what a pro-health span environment looks like. That is an environment that maximizes the duration of life free of chronic age-related conditions. We can maximize the quality of our diet, regular exercise, good sleep hygiene turns out to be important, and obviously that's related to coming up with ways to minimize or reduce stress. Social interaction is associated with healthy lifespan, no smoking, moderate use of alcohol, and maintaining healthy weight. Of course, we see in the United States, from state to state, and even from region to region within cities, we see dramatic variation in health span and lifespan. So here I'm showing you the average lifespan by state, and you can see all the way from about 75 years in Mississippi, and this is the average including men and women. Of course, women live longer than men, up to Hawaii, which has the highest lifespan in this particular database. And so these are not genetic effects, these are environmental, and they involve things that we can alter. So what can geroscience do for us to help maximize healthy lifespan? We know in model organisms, in yeast, in worms, fruit flies, and mice, we can dramatically increase health span. These are data shown on the left. In mice, we can see treatment of low-dose rapamycin, a drug that is commonly used in transplant patients at higher doses. Low dose increases not just lifespan, but also health span in mice. Metformin, a drug very commonly used in people with diabetes, increases lifespan and health span in mice. And there's been lots of discussion over the years about resveratrol, although popular press often talks about it as an quote-unquote anti-aging drug. The data from the laboratory studies is actually not as strong. But here's the thing that really brought Dr. Wohns and I together, and that is while people have been doing these studies now since the early 1990s in laboratory organisms, and since that time have been saying perhaps someday these discoveries will bring us to clinical trials, that time is now. There are many, many, many clinical trials motivated by discoveries in geroscience laboratories, not to try and increase lifespan in people, that would be a 30, 40, 50-year trial, but to use these drugs to try and treat aging-related conditions. And so that raises a lot of very interesting ethical questions and led to Dr. Wohns and I writing this paper that came out the end of last year on lessons for responsible geroscience from the history of longevity. So that's all the background I want to give you, and you'll hear more in this conversation, which we've broken into 3 sections. First, we're going to talk a little bit about our backgrounds to help you understand how we got together to have this unusual interaction. We'll then talk a little bit about the messages that we convey in the paper about geroscience and public health. And then we'll talk about, well, what does happen when a geroscientist and a bioethicist walk into a bar. And I have to say, Dr. Wohns and I have not had a chance to walk into a bar and enjoy a libation, but I hope we will someday soon. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and start with a question for Dr. Wohns. And so before we turn to the article we wrote, why don't you tell us a little bit about the conception of this Journal of Ethics issue on ethical questions on geroscience, and what made you want to take on this theme? What was it about your personal background that led to your interest to actually lead this whole issue on ethical questions?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Promislow. Thanks for that, laying the foundation for the conversation. Well, so I first became interested in philosophical questions about aging during my doctoral program in a graduate seminar on meaning, life, and death. And the question that caught my interest was, is aging bad for you? And it's a compelling question in its simplicity. And it got me thinking about aging and what it means for something to be bad for you. And I think I came across an article by Timothy Murphy from 1986 that said it in the right way, I think, is that asking if aging is a disease is the wrong question. It's really whether aging is objectionable so that prevention and cure is something that ought to be sought. And it really stimulated my thinking about aging and the contemporary biology of aging. And so I started thinking about aging as what makes something objectionable, and aging as a multi-dimensional phenomenon that encompasses biological, social, psychological, even existential dimensions. And that's where, we met. I came to you as your, position as a senior director at some of the longevity programs at University of Washington. We, started having conversations, and the AMA Journal of Ethics has an editorial fellow program, which is really phenomenal. And I pitched an idea recognizing that ethics and geroscience and longevity are exploding now that contemporary geroscience has human trials of these potential gerotherapeutics. And the theme issue is really looking at some of these frontier ethical questions about what biological age means. How do we incorporate some of the new technologies and new advances in geroscience into the clinic? Whether gerotherapy, what specialty of medicine should take on potential gerotherapeutics in the future? But I was so happy that we could take a more historical look at some of these questions. And that's what got these conversations going for at least these specific questions. But what made you want to think about aging, given your history in evolutionary biology and geroscience? What was the thing that made you want to think about this historical context?
Yeah. So for me, it partly went back actually to my college experience. As an undergraduate, I was at the University of Chicago, and there's a great tradition of interdisciplinary thinking. And one of my mentors was an MD, PhD who became a philosopher, Leon Kass, who then, when he led the the Commission on Bioethics in the first Bush administration wrote a piece that argues against trying to figure out how to make people live longer. And so, as someone who was already working in aging at the time, that really got me thinking about how to understand the interaction between these different disciplines. And of course, I love studying aging because it's like the hub at the middle of a network that connects everything. And so I was sort of primed when you came to me to be excited about your interests. And then the other thing is being trained as an evolutionary biologist and an evolutionary geneticist, I've always been really interested in variation. And what the laboratory excels at is controlling everything. We always teach our undergraduate students and graduate students that one of the most important things they need to do in their experiments is to control for every extraneous variable other than the thing that they are trying to alter or ask about. And so typically studies, whether in worms or yeast or flies or mice, in aging only look at one genotype. And of course, we are all genetically tremendously diverse. And so the history of aging ignores that variation. We here at HNRCA, there's a great tradition in precision nutrition, the idea that the ideal diet might depend on your environment and your genetics, and the history of aging really ignores that variability. And so to me, that's a concern, that the assumption that a drug that works in a mouse should be trialed in people and that it's going to work for everybody. It might not. And so I was really interested in thinking about the ethical implications of that variation. And then the other piece, which I mentioned in my introduction, I remember early on when I was going to seminars, Cynthia Kenyon, one of the founders of the field of modern molecular geroscience, who discovered what the first gene was that was known to extend lifespan in a worm, I remember her saying, maybe someday my discoveries will end up in the clinic. And so the other thing for me that really led me to sort of be primed for this conversation, this work with you, was the fact that we are now in the clinic. And so it behooves us to be thinking about these things. The last thing I'll mention, I thought about how in the 1970s, when that biologists were first figuring out how to create transgenic bacteria, and nobody knew what would happen. And there was actually a big meeting at Asilomar with the leaders in the field to talk about whether this was safe and ethical. And we haven't done that kind of thing. We haven't brought together philosophers and geroscientists at our meetings. And I'll just say that I hope that this ongoing conversation will be a model for many people to have these kinds of conversations and to come together. So I'll stop there, but I want to move to the actual paper and ask you a little bit to speak a little bit about it. And as I showed in the slides, we've doubled life expectancy in this country over the past 150 years, but it's really been driven by public health related factors: sanitation, nutrition, prenatal and maternal care, rising standards of living, antibiotics, vaccines. Some of those things we treat at the individual level. An individual goes to get a vaccine, but they're very much motivated and supported by public health initiatives. So can you walk us through your thoughts on why this distinction matters, public health versus individual health, for how we think about geroscience today?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about, so you presented great slides on the last 150, 200 years, and these amazing gains in lifespan, average lifespan at the population level. Um, and, we're interested in the factors that influence longevity, life expectancy, lifespan, even health span, the period of healthy living. And the focus, as you were saying, now is on these cutting edge new potential pharmaceuticals that individuals can take to potentially affect their rate of aging. And but we've already changed people's lifespans, and these are through what we call public health interventions. And so looking at those, I think, was the question about sort of what influences health span and lifespan. Well, all these public health initiatives do. So what are the things that we take away from that? Well, one is that, so when we say public health interventions, let's be specific. So we mean, as you were saying, improvements in waste management, sanitation, clean water, nutritional yields, food fortification, all the ones that you mentioned. One way of thinking about those is that they affect communal goods, shared resources that are necessary for living: water, air, food, and they're made available to the public. So we can think of them almost as communal goods, as we wrote, collective goods. Vaccines might be lumped into that because they are made widely available, and they also have knock-on effects, as these others do. These specific public health interventions manipulate disease ecology. They decrease transmission of infectious diseases. Is their primary, one of their primary means of reducing early life mortality and improving life expectancy is through decreasing disease transmission. But they also, of course, improve growth and development, sort of bolster early life growth and development. Contrast those with individualized treatments or interventions that can also increase lifespan. We saw from the 1950s forward, we saw improvements in modern medicine and cardiovascular interventions, cancer treatments, dialysis, the things that didn't target childhood mortality, but mid and late life, mostly. Of course, some cancers, childhood cancers as well. But just from a categorical level, they don't have the same sort of knock-on effects by affecting ecology. They're individualized. And so even if it's a rough and ready distinction, it's still useful to think of these different sort of interventions in these terms as we do. And so if that's the case, then we might be able to say that longevity is inherently social, that it has in two sort of ways. One is that many of the factors that influence longevity are social and communal. They affect shared goods. But the second thing that we also talked about was also that increasing longevity has dramatic effects on the structure of society, social, economic, political institutions and norms and activities. And so in two converse or complementary ways, health and longevity is deeply social. As we know, this is not something, social determinants of health, we've known for decades that they're very closely intertwined. But looking back at the history, it teaches us that gerotherapies are just one sort of small slice of this much wider world that affects longevity. But so that's some of the public health framing that we took in some of our conversations, and environmental influences on longevity. Of course, I haven't mentioned the genetic components, the genetic determinants of longevity or the influences. And so I would turn to you to ask, so heritability of lifespan, we know, is actually perhaps much less than most people recognize. Studies show it might be on the order of 20 to 30%. And so I wonder if you can speak on how that factors into this much wider world that we are painting.
Yeah, I actually think this is a really relevant question for a lot of what a lot of people here at the center work on in terms of nutrition, that we need to ask ourselves, so how does the genetic architecture of lifespan should it influence how we think about the ability to maximize healthy aging? with nutritional or other interventions. And this is a really timely question, and I will try and be brief. So there's a paper that came out 2 weeks ago in Science. The first author was Shenhar. The senior author is Uri Alan. So it comes out from Uri Alan's lab at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. Came out in Science, and it argued that actually the numbers that you quote, 20 to 30%, have been underestimated. And in fact, because we didn't account for the fact that all of this extrinsic mortality of 150 years or 100 years ago is now no longer around, the heritability of lifespan is actually closer to 50%. I actually think it's that conclusion is wrong, and it misdefines heritability, and some colleagues of mine and I are now working on a response. So the first thing I would caution this audience, and once we publish it, you can judge, but I would caution the audience not to assume that the Alan paper is correct. But it generated a tremendous amount of interest, and we could spend our entire time here just talking about the philosophical implications of that. All the major newspapers around the world wrote articles about it, and I'm just going to tell you one headline that struck me from the New York Times. So a really great science reporter, Gino Collada, wrote an article about the paper, and the headline, which of course she didn't choose, there are people who write headlines, and the headline is, "Genes may control your longevity, however healthily you live." Genes may control your longevity, however healthily you live. The implication is that if heritability is 50%, then we might as well just accept that there's not a lot that we can do about our lifespan. And I think that's misleading and potentially dangerous. Even if heritability were 50%, and I'm going to argue that it's not in this paper that we're working on, that's a tremendous amount of variation. And it's important to, when we think about what we do in the laboratory and the role that our laboratory research plays in thinking about aging and about the conversations that people like you are leading in the ethics of aging, it's important to distinguish between the great majority of work in the laboratory, which is on the fundamental causes of aging. So whether that's a pathway or a gene or a signaling in the brain or whatever it is, and those are different from the factors that explain variation. And so I think we've made tremendous advances in understanding the fundamental causes of aging. We actually have a long way to go. We've learned a lot from epidemiology and human genetic studies, but we have a long way to go to really understand what influences variation in aging. But we do know that it's malleable. We talked about some of those factors that make it malleable. The other thing that I would say is really just, we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, and I'll just sort of put it out there as an important complicating factor, is that, so all the variation in any trait that we measure, it could be height, it could be walking speed. For this conversation, let's say it's lifespan. All the variation that we observe in a population is due to genetic variation and environmental variation and the interaction between the two. And that means that the effect of a gene on lifespan might depend on the environment that it's in. And so we still have a lot to learn. And in fact, there might be some, and this is a really important question, and I think an exciting one, there might be some genotypes that buffer the stressors that we experience. And certainly there's evidence in centenarians that some of them seem to be very resilient, even though they have genes that should have led them to have Alzheimer's disease, they don't. And there might be other genotypes that make them particularly sensitive in a good way to exercise or a healthy diet. And so we really need to come at this with a broad perspective. And so as we think about what we're doing in the lab, I'm curious what your thoughts are about these gerotherapies. I mean, we have these gerotherapies that people want to use to target midlife and old age, and that's very different from all the public health interventions, not all, but most of the public health interventions, and most of the bang that we got from that public health buck was early life, um, higher survival. Um, so can you, and you talked a little bit about this distinction between individualized and population wide, but I wonder if you could maybe dig down a little deeper about how we should be thinking about these interventions, what they do, and now that they're actually um, in the clinic. And I guess I would add to that, you also raised the question of who should be involved from the clinician side in these things, and I'm curious about your thoughts there.
Yeah. First, yeah. So I want to say one thing in both in answering your question, but also in response to your very interesting comments about the genetic components. Um, the focus is on revealing the malleable, modifiable um, features that influence longevity, um, such as physical activity and changes in nutrition, um, other sort of behavioral aspects. But I wanted to make just a comment about this shift in or the that sort of narrative, because there is a risk, and this will transition to answer your question. Um, um, it's important to emphasize people that there are things they can do change in their life to improve their health and longevity in particular, since it's the topic of today. Um, such as improving their, increasing their activity, eating healthier, etc. Um, there is a risk, however, of neglecting the more structural elements that go into conditioning or constraining people's real choices in their life, structural things that are maybe greater determinants of someone's longevity than their individual choices. We know that marginalized communities through racism or poverty or environmental exposure, those are large determinants of their health and longevity that are perhaps more important than, or just more influential than their range of real choices in their life. And so there is a small risk of shifting the narrative to personal responsibility that neglects the wider responsibility of the community and society at large in making large level policy decisions and changes that can affect large swaths of the population. And that's where a lot of the responsibility might lie, in addition to encouraging people to adopt healthy habits. So I wanted to just add that there, as a way to also answer your other question about how do we think about gerotherapies in the historical context, specifically public health versus individualized treatments. One thing that we need to keep in mind is what is our duty to help people in the way of their longevity. One is, of course, through justice considerations, what we owe to each individual. Equity is something we hear often, and has to do with affording each person their due, treating people with respect in virtue of their shared humanity. And so we have to ask how that factors into these sort of discussions about public health, individualized treatments. One is not necessarily superior to the other. They both can make real difference in people's lives, but without deliberate policy, potential gerotherapies, because of their individualized nature, risk uh, just advantaging people who are already advantaged, leaving people behind who are being left behind, and exacerbating these sort of inequalities. That's a risk of individualized treatments, I think I could say, from a category standpoint, unless they're made just widely accessible and easily available to everyone. And I think that's where our distinctions there, we can get some where the rubber hits the road a little bit. So a solution would just be to make them widely available, and not astronomically expensive or just reserved for certain groups. Um, so that's one way I'd answer your question. I'd be curious to hear what your experience has been thinking about these sort of obligations or these sort of um, thoughts and how they translate or are used in the research domain. Um, do they have, in your experience, have they influenced research priorities in the carrying out of preclinical or clinical trials that you've been involved in?
Yeah, I mean, this is an important question, and it's a hard question because it's not one that we generally think about. I just want to ask you before we go there.
Mhm.
So you briefly mentioned these sort of around issues of equity that um, maybe not everybody will be able to access the the therapies that people discover that could increase healthy lifespan. Um, and I wonder if you could just share a little bit more about your thoughts of, is this different from access to um, many different kinds of healthcare? I mean, um, here in the US, we have access to the most advanced uh, diagnostics and treatments of anywhere in the world, and yet there are also, in some cases, tremendous costs. If we think about something like a bone marrow transplant, that not everybody in the world can afford that. So, can we, in thinking about things like gerotherapeutics, is this the same or is it different? Do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, the question of a just healthcare system is a large and difficult one. It's not only about access to healthcare and healthcare treatments, gerotherapeutics and bone marrow transplants would fall in that, but also the the social circumstance that again sort of structures people's whole lives and that go into their health and longevity. And I would say certainly because the proposed gerotherapies that are in human trials now and ones that are soon to be um, are potentially pharmaceuticals that will come to market and they'll be marketed just as we see other things being marketed. I think our experience with GLP-1 like drugs is probably I don't know if it'll be similar, but it would be probably a good model to think about how these will come to market and the challenges there in terms of pricing and access and um, but I think all the same questions will come up. Um, so yeah, so I don't have a great answer for you or a solution. I think our healthcare system faces many challenges, and it's incredibly sophisticated and difficult system. Um, and I don't pretend to have answers now, but I think we have sort of a blueprint of what will happen when these come to market and when we look at some of the GLP-1 receptor agonists.
So, thanks. So to get back to your question about, what should I or can I, as an experimental geroscientist, do to uh, to incorporate these ideas into my work? And I think there are two things that I'm trying to do. And so the first is to invite conversations like this. And I'm really actively working on ways to make sure that everybody's in the room. When I have an opportunity to organize a session at a meeting, I'm looking to see if I can bring in an economist or an ethicist or a public health expert to really begin to think about what are the questions that we as geroscientists should be asking that we don't even know to ask because we don't have the language that you as a philosopher or someone who's in economics or public health might have. And then the second thing that I've always been interested in is just looking at variation. And so, for example, we have work where we have studied the effects of rapamycin, this widely studied drug that people are excited about as a potential gerotherapeutic in different genetic, excuse me, different genetic backgrounds. And sure enough, we find that sometimes it works, and sometimes in some genetic backgrounds, and here we're talking about flies, it does nothing at all. And we're now thinking in my lab about also asking about environmental variation and how environmental variation might influence the impact of a gerotherapeutic. Um, so, so I think there are things that we can do, but really, in the geroscience world, we're just at the beginning, and probably the first most important thing we can do is to invite these kind of conversations to allow us to think about how to get things right. What should we be doing, and if the field does succeed in increasing healthy lifespan, what are the implications? What are the consequences, both sought after consequences and maybe negative unanticipated consequences? So we just have a few minutes left, and especially given the audience that we're talking to here, which thinks a great deal about nutrition, we talked a little bit about behavior, and I'm wondering from your perspective, what your thoughts are about, from a sort of philosophical and ethical perspective, about incentivizing behavioral changes at this nationwide scale.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question about um, what are the what are the ethical questions that are pertinent when thinking about nutrition and aging. Well, first, just building on what we've talked about already, um, nutrition, physical activity, et cetera, crucial elements that affect the hallmarks of aging. Um, but they're constrained by social environment, food environments, socioeconomic status, cultural norms, even social policies. But that they are good examples, I would say, of these sort of public goods or collective goods, in the sense that they can be affected, or at least the infrastructure necessary for nutrition and um, food environments can be affected through social policy, school meals, for instance, community design, social support, availability of healthy foods. And so they're a good example, I think, of the sort of public health related interventions that we should protect and expand and cultivate, and sort of resist the temptation to focus too much on this frontier cutting edge therapeutics as a mean of affecting longevity. That we need to make sure that we promote these bedrock infrastructure that's necessary for health and longevity, such as nutrition. Um, Yeah, and I have a couple other thoughts, but I maybe turn that question to you, and ask you also, what, from your perspective, what you think are the most important things we can do for promoting behavioral interventions and healthy activity.
Um, I mean, I think this is where there's an interesting tension, and something that I think you and I have a lot more to discuss, and with our audience as well, and that is where we should be putting our resources and our efforts. And I mean, I think there's two things about the basic biology of aging that motivate the field, and one is to discover drugs that can keep people healthier longer, for sure. The other is that it's a fundamentally fascinating biological problem that involves millions of species and aging in different ways. And so it's not simply the case that we should shift our resources from molecular geroscience to public health initiatives. I think both are important. I'll just leave it with a sort of question/conundrum that I have, and that is that taking a pill every day is a behavioral choice, and there are lots of people who struggle to be compliant with physician's orders. I'm sure you deal with this in your patients who should be taking a drug every day, and they don't, whether it's for physical health or mental health, and you can't get them to take it. But there's a sense in our field, at least, that if we invent a drug that's going to make people live healthier longer, they're all going to take it, and getting them to eat right is much, much harder. And I guess I'll just leave it as an open question. I'm not an implementation scientist, and that's really what this is about. But I think it's a fascinating and challenging problem that lies at the overlap of our Venn diagram, which I think is really cool.
This has been an amazing dialogue, and I think that what I would like to do, if you don't mind, is open up the Q&A to our audience. For those of you who are technologically challenged like I am, you have to click on the 3 dots at the bottom to get into the Q&A. So while we're waiting for people to enter their questions, first of all, I want to thank both of you. This has been such a fascinating conversation. And clearly, Daniel and Nicolai, you need to organize a full day seminar and have it here, and we can really engage in furthermore this discussion. So Nicolai, this is for you, a question for you. So I am a big fan of the author Atul Gawande, and I read the book Being Mortal, which really focused on end of life. And what really came out to me was there are huge generational differences between on how in different generations view the end of life. With those closer to end of life, viewing it very differently than those earlier in their life cycle. But one thing I wanted to ask you is, geroscience is a global discipline, and different societies put different values, it seems, on older adults in their role in society. So this conversation that you and Daniel have had, do you feel this is global, or do you think that a lot of the issues you're talking about are restricted to North America, given we have a Canadian here and an American here?
Yeah, great question. I'd also be curious to hear what Daniel has to say about this. But yeah, it's a wonderful book by Atul Gawande. I think the differing attitudes towards end of life and death, varying over life stages or ages, is a fascinating phenomenon. It's one of the things I've been interested in. Psychologists of aging study. They run empirical studies of attitudes towards death, and there are several influential theories that there tends to be a shift towards. There's one theory called gerotranscendence, that there's a shift towards a sort of transcendent mindset that accepts death in different ways as we get older. And my question when I read that is this something that's intrinsic to the psychology of aging, or is it contingent on other factors? It's a fascinating topic. I don't have an answer for you, but I sort of share in your excitement for these sort of questions. And I would say that the sort of conversation we've had today is general in the sense that I think it applies to, it's talking about the factors that influence longevity. And so in that way, it can apply across the world, and certainly is consistent with different cultures treating aging in different ways, having different attitudes towards people who are older. And that'll show up in a number of ways, but I certainly think the sort of framework we've been using today, at least, is consistent with that.
Daniel, did you want to comment?
Just a couple of thoughts. So I was at this Academy of Geroscience meeting the weekend before last, and had some of these kinds of conversations, including I was talking with someone a young person who was there, who is a sort of radical lifespan extensionist, maybe we could call her, who would like to see us figure out how to make people live 150 or 200 years. And I mentioned that in my own experience with my family members, who I come from a pretty long-lived lineage, but generally found that when people got into their 90s, they were quite accepting and ready to die. And her response was, well, that's only because that they were experiencing the deleterious effects of aging, and if they were as healthy as they were when they were 30, then they wouldn't want to die. I'm not sure that's true. I just share that as one perspective among some people in the geroscience field. And then I'll just mention that coming from Canada, and almost all of my family is still in Canada, all across the country, and there's a very active discussion right now in Canada because of its legalization of what they call MAID, medically assisted dying, and I think it will be interesting to see how that influences discussions around aging. If people are choosing MAID not because they have a terminal illness that is extremely painful, but because they are a certain age, whatever that is, and have decided that they've lived long enough and are ready to die. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
So we have two questions and they're really around the same topic. So why don't I just try not to mangle the essence of them and to combine them. And it relates to the pervasive influence of AI, speeding up, accelerating anti-aging drug discovery, and optimizing biological age reduction. So what both the questions from Dr. Saidath and Dr. Jiangdong Wang is really, how do you envision the challenges of the ethical considerations, which in their eyes may lag behind the AI-driven innovation in the space of geroscience? And I'll hand it to both of you.
I'll just add a little bit more, and because I think it's really an ethical question for Nicolai. So again, at this meeting that I was just at, there was a panel on AI, and one of the things, just as an example, someone who is a geroscientist, well-known geroscientist, Morgan Levine, was talking about in her group how they're using AI to generate virtual laboratories where there are AI systems that allow them to put in a virtual space an expert in biochemistry and an expert in epigenetics and an expert in coding, and they bring all these experts together virtually to try and move things along faster. So they are certainly, people are certainly trying to use AI to speed up discovery, and obviously there's lots of work in drug discovery now, identifying novel targets. And so I would just underscore the question for Nicolai of whether AI is just, in terms of ethics and implementation and policy, is AI just going to end up helping us get out over our skis?
Yeah, it's a great question. My thinking about this is that there are many interesting and urgent ethical questions that have to do with AI. This one in particular, I think, is just about accelerating the timeline likely to developing and discovering and developing and bringing to market potential gerotherapeutics. And so, and the other ethical questions about AI are maybe not as important for this. This is, I think, primarily about, are we ready for these sort of interventions? And that question is a emphatic no, in the sense that we're certainly not ready. Something we've touched on in this today is just the wide-ranging societal ramifications of changes in longevity, of changing career trajectories, family structures, healthcare structures, in terms of pensions, Social Security. All these things are very seriously affected by changes in longevity. Of course, any changes in longevity will take a while to see, of course. So in that sense, we're not ready for the interventions, but at the same time, they'll take a while to show up. Um, and so, yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. I think it's something that just sort of, again, underscores the importance of these conversations and bringing people together from, as Dr. Promislow was saying, from economics and demography and, public policy scientists, ethicists, everybody together to really sort of think seriously and with nuance about these questions and making meaningful steps towards the sort of society that we want to see.
I would just add one thing, which also I think everybody here is aware, but AI, implementing AI in our research or in anything that we do, doesn't release us from needing to evaluate its output carefully as thoughtful human beings. That AI often gets it wrong, and we need to make sure that we're responsible for whether what comes out of AI models is correct or not.
Thank you. So we have two more questions. One is from one of our postdocs, Kritika, and she said, "Thank you so much for the amazing presentation." I endorse that, by the way. Can you shed some light on meditation and mindful practice as an intervention in aging?
I don't have any expertise. Maybe Nicolai does.
I don't have too much expertise in that, besides just saying that I think it can have. I have some colleagues here at University of Washington in the neurology department in neuroscience who advocate strongly for mindfulness in specifically in relation to aging related concerns and issues. And so I would just say that I've seen them have many benefits. And so, but I don't have any particular expertise in it.
Great, thank you. So I think, given the time, this is probably our last question, and it is from Roger Fielding, one of our scientists here at the HNRCA. One might consider GLP-1 agonists as a gerotherapeutic. Are there lessons that can be learned from their development and approval that can help in the thinking about new gerotherapeutics?
So I'll start with the sort of practical geroscience perspective on this, and then hand it over to Nicolai. Roger, thank you for that question. It's such a great one. So when we think about gerotherapeutics, we're really thinking about drugs that we hope and hypothesize will not just delay the onset of or decrease the severity or risk of a specific age-related disease, but will slow down the rate of aging itself, which will then ideally delay or decrease the effects of many, many different age-related diseases. And so the GLP-1 agonists appear to do that. The reality is that FDA does not approve aging as a target. And if you try and develop a drug as a gerotherapeutic, the FDA won't approve it. If you develop it as an obesity drug or a diabetes drug or a heart disease drug, and then it also happens to affect many other things, then it's a way to get it approved. So if GLP-1 agonists had been developed in a geroscience lab for aging, they probably wouldn't be on the market. And so that's just sort of a practical perspective. And I'll hand it over to Nicolai for his philosophical take on that.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question that we've discussed a little bit before. I think let's see. I'm just thinking what I want to add to your comments already, besides just agreeing with you. The question I'll say about FDA, whether the FDA should change their designation of aging itself as a therapeutic target, is a fascinating one. There's an article in a theme issue I did that argues that they should. I think it's a difficult question. I'm not totally convinced. I think we had a conversation about whether GLP-1 agonists, the difference between um, slowing aging and preventing age-related diseases, um, and um, and sort of the aging hypothesis, whether those are the same things or at least one leads to the other. I think, and then we also had a conversation about whether we should be restricting gerotherapeutics to this sort of definition, whether we should be more capacious with our understanding of gerotherapeutics, anything that's improving healthy aging, for instance, however you want to define that. So yeah, I guess I'll just say if, those words in agreement with Daniel's comments, and maybe we can leave it at that for time purposes.
Great. Well, listen, on behalf of the HNRCA, thank you both for a wonderful discussion on this really important topic. And I hope we can have you come back in the near future to expand on this. And to the audience, we will be posting this seminar on our website within the next few weeks. So thank you all for participating, and thank you to all of those who posted questions. Take care and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.